turn to the American people to share my hopes and intentions.
And the government exists for the American people and to govern this country.
It is the American people who endured the great challenge of lifting us from the depths of national calamity.
There is a sociological mystery here. Politicians who run for public office have directed promises and entreaties to a strange, perhaps mythical tribe called the American people. What the American people want is no new taxes. What the American people need is 2 cars in every garage and a chicken in every pot. The mystery is this. Who is this mythical tribe? Who are these people politicians talk about with such familiarity? What do they look like? What do they think and dream and feel? Are they the black people from the mining towns of southern Illinois? The migrant workers in the spinach fields of Crystal City, Texas? The Basque shepherds of Montana? The Irish who fled the potato famine? Or the English who fled religious persecution? Or the Mennonites who found a place nearer to God? Or the Huguenots who found one farther away? Who are the American people? Are they the Poles of South Chicago? The Chinese of the Mississippi Delta? The Cherokee who live at the end of the Trail of Tears? The Cajuns who dwell at the end of Evangeline's journey? Just who are the American people anyway?
Culture is everything that mankind does and makes. Everything in the man-made environment. And culture also is a response to challenges in the environment. First, I want to say that culture is very important in man's survival because mankind has very little inherited genetic programming. He's not hardwired for a lot. He has very little in the way of pre-programming. What he has are a few instincts and the ability to talk, and when he's a little older in his infancy, he can walk. But apart from that, there's not a big genetic component to his culture.
If culture is not a matter of the genes, it must be a matter of human need. When we examine the cultures of the earth, we find they emerged as a response to human need. Although these needs are universal, the various ways people respond to them are almost infinite in their variety. Human history is like a great ball in which dancers dance their different pattern steps, circling, weaving, and sometimes touching, borrowing what they find beautiful or useful in the expression of their own dance. Culture is always in motion, a process, changing, evolving.
Cultures develop in response to challenges in the environment. And that may be adaptations to natural phenomena such as volcanoes, tidal waves, massive fires, earthquakes, or, most important today, cultures respond to contact with other cultures, and they borrow from those cultures quite often. A good example of this is American technology, which is diffused all over the world. And it doesn't matter whether you're in Africa or Japan, there are American products or imitation products all over the world, and people are using them in their day-to-day life. And when we go to another country or when we interact with people from another ethnic group, we tend to assume that they have the same systems which we do. And this is not always true. The way I am communicating to you, we have eye contact, I'm looking at you. Now this is very, very hard in the Japanese, and I never realized this till I worked in Japan. Japanese feel threatened by you when you look them in the eye. Or at the very least, if they make allowances for the fact that you're a foreigner, a gaijin who doesn't know, they feel as if they're on trial. You know, it's like a searchlight. They feel under that spotlight when you're looking at them. So when you go to meetings in Japan, you try, at least I tried, to look in the corner of the room, to look up at the ceiling, to keep my eyes down the way the Japanese do. But this comes hard because it's a violation of everything. You know, we say to our children, look at me when you're speaking. And you see, that's how you learn this eye contact business. So there are really dozens of informal rules of behavior, which are very, very important. Acquired culture is what you learn informally by imitation. The child looks around the family, sees what they do, and he imitates that. That's the simplest example. Learned behavior is what goes on when you read books or you go to school. It's a technical transfer of knowledge. There is a real place in our culture today for traditional patterns and for laws and for standards that people can agree are important in their own particular group. I mean, we need that because everything is changing so fast. People cling to something to believe in.
You know, when I think of the American people, I tend to think in terms of the fact that everybody in this country came from someplace else, so that the roots go back to many, many different societies and many different cultures. If we talk about primary roots, we're of course talking about those called Native Americans, but they too were immigrants, of course, coming over a land bridge from Asia. And if we think of the secondary roots, which really became dominant, we tend to think, and I think correctly, the European traditions that brought the institutions, the values, the norms that generally define what our society is about, for good or ill, and sometimes it's not always for good. I'm thinking in terms of some of the things that Europeans did in bringing people, for example, African slaves, what they did to the Native Americans, is all part of the culture, all part of the complexity of our culture.
The people of the old world came to the new. The customs, traditions, languages, folklore, and values they brought with them would shape that uncommon community we have come to call the American people. The old world shaped the new. Yet as immigrants came to these shores, they found that their cultures developed in other lands in previous times, would not remain untouched by the power of the new physical and social environment. People of differing cultures were brought into close contact. The encounter was sometimes peaceful, sometimes violent. Yet the result, over time, was a kind of cultural patchwork quilt of fascinating patterns. Consider three designs in the pattern the American people weave. The Chinese of the Mississippi Delta, the Cherokee of Georgia and Oklahoma, and the Acadians, or Cajuns, of Louisiana.
Most people who we now know as Acadians came from the province of Nova Scotia. In the 1750s, a great dispute broke out when the French Canadians refused to swear allegiance to the King of Canada. And basically, for all practical purposes, they were deported, and which has been depicted in the poem Evangeline by Longfellow, in which we were separated from our roots. In French, we call it le grand dérangement, the great separation. I think that one of the phrases which best exemplifies the pride we have is the fact that we tend to differentiate who is Cajun from who is not. All people who are not Cajun we refer to as les Américains, the Americans.
The Cherokees thrived in southeastern United States for about 500 years. It was a land base in North Carolina, Tennessee, Georgia, and Alabama. And through time, treaties were developed with the United States that affected this land base and eventually dwindled it down to a smaller size. The Cherokees were in contact with the white culture. The colonists were settling in this area. There were traders coming in. There were missionaries coming in also. And this affected the educational system. And also the Cherokees adopted a lot of the white man's ways. And they used this for their own advantage. They set up a government. Previously there was a town government, and it eventually evolved into a national government. One of the treaties that the Cherokees made with the United States was in 1835. It was called the New Echota Treaty. And actually a minority of Cherokees signed the treaty with the United States. And what this did was that it gave up the lands in the east for lands in what is now Oklahoma. And this provided the base for all Cherokees to be removed. However, the vast majority did not sign into this treaty, and they refused to leave. They were under the direction of John Ross, the principal chief at that time. And we're talking about 17,000 Cherokees who remained in the East. Eventually, the government under Andrew Jackson removed the Cherokees to the West. And this is what became known as the Trail of Tears. It involved about 17,000 forcibly removed, a lot of times at gunpoint, from the east and marched along the trail to what is now Oklahoma. Approximately 4,000 Cherokees died along this trail from hunger, exposure, and disease.
My father came over when he was 12 because the opportunity just wasn't there in South China. The land wasn't good for growing crops. There were a lot of people. And so he had an uncle that had said that there was an opportunity here if he will come and work hard, that he can make a life here in Mississippi. I have never been able to find out exactly who the first Chinese settler was here, other than that it went back to the early 1900s. My father came over in 1912, so it goes back a long ways, but somebody came over before him, and I don't know whether it was a great uncle or a cousin or a friend, but I think, of course, you know, you always think of the Chinese coming over with the railroad. Well, there were Chinese that came over to also to pick cotton, to do, you know, hard manual labor in the fields.
There are some souls that come along the Mississippi River through New Orleans, where they jump the boat and find out the cotton pickers are looking for places to buy snack food, like maybe lunch, hot dogs, and sandwiches. Why should we work in the river and for a very small amount of money, while we can get out and open a little consistency selling hot dogs, maybe soft drinks, so make our own money. And that's what I heard about the grocery store I started.
There are three major factors which I think kept the dominant culture away from us for a long time. Number one is a physical barrier. The Atchafalaya Basin created a massive swamp to the east of us. The Gulf is to the, Mexico is to the south of us. And Texas was largely unsettled when Cajuns first came into this area in the late 1700s. So there was a physical isolation. There was also, because of the religion, an isolation from much of the rest of the South. And finally, the language barrier itself. So many people were illiterate in English, so therefore could not have been influenced a great deal by newspapers, even radio when it came in later. Somewhere around the 50s and into the early 60s, when the oil industry really boomed in South Louisiana, the dominant culture began to really have an impact on South Louisiana. Homes were modernized. We shifted from an economy which was largely dependent upon fishing, farming, to one which largely depended upon the oil industry. So that actually we developed skilled trades and that kind of thing. So I believe that the dominant culture affected us largely in the economic area. Unfortunately, at the same time, this helped to deteriorate some of the things we cherish in this area, some of the values. While many of our children today do still cherish many of the older values, still there's a great fear that we've become so affected by mass media, by popular culture, and a lot of the other things, that maybe we've lost many things of beauty that we may never retain, or we may never return to, I should say.
These are three American subcultures. That is, they constitute a unique way of life within American culture. They are struggling to retain aspects of their original culture while being continually influenced by the dominant culture.
I feel the Cajuns of South Louisiana have a unique lifestyle, brought about by several factors. One, of course, is a heritage of language. Most of us still speak some semblance of the French language. Some of us speak it very fluently. Most of our ancestors spoke French exclusively as the first language. Unfortunately, a white Anglo-dominated state government saw fit to punish people, to drive French out of the public schools. Today, we're trying to revitalize the French language. We also have a way of life which many people have characterized or paraphrased by la joie de vivre, which means the joy of living. You eat well, you work hard, When work is over with, you play, you eat good food, you dance, you very festive in many ways. All is a part of life. In a family context, you do all of these things. And such as festivals on weekends, dances,